today. My name is Beth Harrison, and the other person whose name is appearing as Beth Harrison is actually Amanda Korber, my colleague, and we both work at the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia. I know we know a number of you all who are joining us today. So we have a PowerPoint presentation that we're going to go through to basically go over the current law in DC on hardship petitions, and then what the Reclaim Rent Control Coalition is requesting. And we did this at a certain, it's somewhat general. And so especially those of you who may have questions more in the weeds, maybe we can try to save those till the end. And so I asked Ina to set this for an hour and a half. I don't think we need all that time, but I thought at the end, if folks have questions they want to talk about that are a little more in the weeds, that might be a good time to do that. So, feel free to raise questions throughout and we'll try to monitor them. But I think especially at the end, and if there are kind of deeper dive questions, we can try to take those then. And I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to start going through our slides. Except, let me advance. There we go.
Okay. So this is just a general overview of what we're going to try to hit on today. So the first part will be what the current law is around hardship petitions, so how rent increases are calculated, who benefits under the current law, and how it leads to displacement. And then Beth is going to talk about the Reclaim Rent Control Platform and the omnibus legislation that the coalition is, attempting to get the council to introduce this legislative session. So I think this is probably something that everyone on this call has probably heard a lot. So the basic sort of concept behind the current hardship petition law is that landlords are entitled to a 12% profit each year, and that's based on their equity in the building. And so to get at what this actually means in practice, there are two important numbers to think about. So the first number is, what is the landlord's profit? And the sort of general, big picture way of thinking about profit is, what's the landlord's income on the property, and what are their expenses on the property? And then the second big number to keep in mind when we're talking about what does it mean to make a 12% profit each year is, what equity does the landlord have in the property? How do we figure out what the landlord's equity is? And the main sort of the big picture way of doing that, and we can talk about it in a little more detail in a little bit, is to look at what the property's overall value is and then subtract out any loans or debts that the landlord may have associated with the property. So to talk a little bit more about profit under the current law. So income, when we talk about what is the landlord's income on a property, we're talking about what is all of their income on the property. This means, what do they collect in rent? And that can get further complicated still. The term that's used is maximum potential rental income, and that means, what is the amount of rent that they could have collected on their property for the year that they choose to report on if they had taken all rent increases that they were entitled to. And then it also includes, if they collect parking fees, it includes parking fees. Even if they have washing machines on the premises that people have to put quarters in to use, whatever income they make from those machines gets counted. So it really is supposed to be sort of a big picture look at all of the money that a property generates in any given 12-month period for a landlord.
That also includes, oh, go ahead, sorry. I was gonna add something.
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
It also includes, if they have units, for example, they have a unit that they're using as the rental office, or sometimes they'll offer a break to employees. If there are things they're choosing to do where they're not maximizing their income for this formula, you have to look at what really is the maximum income they could get if they were maximizing the building as it sits right now.
And it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, because normally what we think of is landlords taking every possible rent increase that they could take at any given moment. But if a landlord is anticipating filing a hardship petition for a particular 12-month period, they might think they're being, sneaky or or coming up with a great idea by not taking particular rent increases that they might otherwise be entitled to take in order to keep their maximum rental income lower. And so once you figure out sort of what the landlord's overall income is for a property, then what happens is they're able to subtract out all of their expenses. And so what counts as an expense is kind of what you might expect an expense to count as. So it includes things like management fees, mortgage interest, utilities, trash, any sort of maintenance and repair costs. All of these can get broken down and start to get really complicated and have really interesting questions come up about what they mean. So for example, the law kind of presumes that a 6% management fee is reasonable. But if a landlord tries to, and by 6% management fee, what we mean is like 6% of the total rent collected is presumed to be sort of a reasonable management fee under the law. But if a landlord, say, tries to argue that they actually spent 7% of total rents collected on management, they then they have like a higher bar to justify that additional percent. And then the other place where it can get tricky, or where I should say we often will dispute with landlords what their expenses actually are in the maintenance and repair category. And so, this includes things that you would expect it to include. There was a leak in the ceiling and the landlord came and fixed it, and it cost him, $200 to do that. And so that was an expense during the 12-month period. But oftentimes where we disagree with landlords is, and this actually, it literally just happened in a petition that I am reviewing right now, a landlord will say, well, during the last 12 months, I replaced the roof and it cost $26,000. And so that's a $26,000 expense I had in this last year that needs to be taken out of all of the income that I, generated. And the case law is relatively clear in DC, but frankly could be clearer that things like that, capital expenses that yes, you take at one point in time, but really the value of that expense you're going to see for years to come. So, right, you only replace a roof maybe once, every 10 or 20 years. And so you shouldn't be allowed to kind of claim that expense all in one year when you're going to be kind of profiting and benefiting from that expense for many years to come. And you're not going to be redoing that repair every year for the next 20 years. And so a lot of the work we do in reviewing petitions is trying to catch these things that landlords try to write off as one-time expenses, but really should be spread out over a period of 10 or 20 years. And the roof is kind of like the easiest example because everybody knows you don't replace a roof every year, but there are things like appliances, and then even like, if they replace countertops or cabinets, things like that, that a landlord maybe is going to do once, but, maybe every 5 or 10 years, but they will, and sometimes when you're reviewing, it's kind of clear that landlords are picking a particular period on which to report their expenses, and it might be a period where they happen to do a lot of cabinet replacements or countertop replacements, or some other really big expense. And you're going to want to look through all of that, look through all the documents about the maintenance and repairs they did, and try to catch where, yeah, that's not, and try to catch where the landlord's saying, yeah, this is a one-time expense, but you kind of even can figure it out kind of intuitively or common, like a lot of it's common sense that, that really isn't a one-time expense. So once you kind of figure out the universe of expenses, you're going to take the income calculation that you figured out how much money they're generating, and you're going to subtract out all the other expenses. And then that's going to be sort of the profit that the landlord has been making for the last 12 months. And it's just notes some things you definitively cannot include as an expense if you're the landlord, and that's things like lobbying fees. So if you pay a fee to a particular organization to lobby on your behalf, you can't include that fee in your operating expenses. If you got fined by the government, you can't include that. And then, there's some other, I think, categories of stuff you're not allowed to include, but it's not a very expansive list of stuff you're not allowed to include at all. So this is just kind of putting hard numbers on what the current law is. So in this example, we're assuming that the landlord's income is $120,000 a year in rent, $20,000 in parking fees that they collect, another $10,000 in laundry, for a total of $150,000. Then we've created some sort of like some, imaginary but realistic numbers, perhaps, on what the landlord's expenses might be. So $60,000 per year for their mortgage, $20,000 a year for utilities, another $20,000 maybe for repairs, and that equals $100,000. So if you subtract out their expenses from their income, they're making about $50,000, which is a 33% profit rate. And so you might see that and think, this landlord isn't experiencing a hardship. In fact, this landlord's turning a profit and making quite a bit of money on their building. But under current law, that's not quite the case. So under current law, what you would have to do after figuring out what profit the landlord is turning on their building is figure out what the landlord's equity is in that property. So the property value is based on whatever the DC's tax assessed value of the property is. And then you subtract out any mortgage or other debts that are tied to the property that the landlord has. So if in this example, the property was bought for $1 million in 2010, and the landlord or the owner used a mortgage to purchase it, say $700,000 like we're doing here, but then in 2020, that property is now worth $1.5 million, and the landlord's paid down that loan quite a bit, so there's only $500,000 left. What that means is the landlord's guaranteed 12% on $1 million, and that's because the property is worth $1.5 million, and he only owes $500,000 on his mortgage. So that means that he has $1 million worth of equity in that property, and so he's actually entitled, under the current law, to $120,000 of return each year, which means that based on the prior number where he was only getting $100,000, or was it 50 in the last slide based on our model? I think it was 50.
50,
he was
yeah.
only turning $50,000 in profit. So based on the current formula, he would be he is entitled to be making $70,000 a year more on that property than he's currently making. And what that means for the tenants in reality is that he is allowed to raise their rents whatever percent necessary to get himself to that $120,000 a year. And you can imagine how much that would be, right? If they're making $50,000 and he needs to be making more than double that, that means that their rents are going up way more than 50% each year under the current formula. And so some other aspects of current rent control, current hardship petition law, and I was kind of alluding to some of these just before, is that rent increase is going to be taken all at once. So if the so the landlord is going to file that petition with the Rental Accommodations Division, and if the rent administrator approves the rent increase that they're seeking, that rent increase, if the tenants don't challenge it, or frankly, if the tenants challenge it and lose, that rent increase is going to be taken all at once. So that means if the rent increase is 60%, the landlord can, the month after it's approved, take that rent increase of 60%. And the other thing about it is it's permanent. There's no way to ever roll that back. If the landlord all of a sudden starts, making a ton of money on his property, if the next year he has very few expenses, if the 12 months he chose to report on happen to have a lot of repair and maintenance costs, but the next 12 months have next to none, there's not like you can adjust it down in later years. That rent increase is going to be permanent. I realize now, Beth, one thing we didn't put on these slides, and I think there are some proposed changes in the current law, is about housing code violations at properties. And so I will just say one other thing under the current law is that it's not clear what the impact of housing code violations existing at the property have on a landlord's ability to file for a hardship petition increase. So it's just, there's a lot of different provisions that kind of touch on whether it's allowed or the filing of these hardship petitions is allowed, while housing code violations exist at the property. And of course, tenant advocates argue, and I think we have pretty good footing in the law to say that if housing code violations exist at the property, the landlord cannot take these increases. But the way it's drafted and the way it's in the law in sort of various places in slightly different ways, it's a little bit confusing to figure out, like, okay, well, if the housing code violation existed when the petition was filed, but by the time it's approved, it's fixed, is that okay? Can they approve the petition, but then just not let them take the increase until after they fix everything? It's just not very clear exactly what the impact of a housing code violation has on a landlord's ability to file a hardship petition and then take a hardship petition increase. And I think that the proposed legislation, which Beth will talk about, I think tries to fix that a little bit and maybe fix isn't the right word, maybe just make more clear is the right way to think about it.
Yes, good point.
So who benefits under the current law? So it's kind of counterintuitive in that the landlords who have the easiest time proving that they have a quote unquote hardship are landlords who have the most cash in their buildings. So a landlord who didn't have to use a mortgage, who didn't have to take out a loan to buy a building is going to be in the best place to argue that they have a hardship, because if a building is worth $1 million and they bought it all in cash, when you figure out what a 12% return on their equity is, you're using that whole $1 million figure. You don't have to subtract out any mortgage. You don't have to subtract out any loan that they have on the property. Whereas a landlord who has to rely on a mortgage to purchase the entire property and can put very little down is actually going to kind of be in a worse position under the current law to prove that they have a hardship. And so cash-strapped landlords are actually less able to prove hardship under the current law, which is kind of exactly the opposite of how you might think it would work. These last 2 points, Beth actually has done a lot of work over the years pulling all of the hardship petitions that have been filed. And what she found is probably not surprising, which is that of the landlords who have filed for hardships, over half of them are actually turning a profit on their property. So it's not like they're losing money. It's not even like they're breaking even at the end of the year. They're actually making money on their properties, but still able under the current broken formula to argue that they're experiencing a hardship. And a full 1/3 of those landlords are making almost close to 20% plus profits. So these are landlords who are making a lot of money on their property, but because of the way the formula is structured to be based on equity, they're able to claim under the law that they have a hardship and that they're entitled to very big increases.
And if you look at those numbers, the profits, current profits before they get the rent increase, if the hardship petition is granted, I mean, they range all the way up to, there's one petition in there that was filed for a landlord who was making 100% profit. And so, he was making twice as much money as he needed to break even each year, and still under the formula was able to file a hardship petition. So we've definitely used those statistics in the past when we've been arguing to try to get change to the current.
And so what are the impact of these petitions that are filed, especially now that we know that most landlords are actually turning profits at the time they're filing these petitions? So the average rent increase that's approved is $642 or 70%. And that's huge. And again, that's all at once. That means you're going to get you're a tenant, you're going to get a notice that, hey, next month in 30 days, your rent is going up 70%. And what we see over and over again in these cases is that tenants, some are just displaced because they cannot possibly afford those rents, but others kind of will move out and leave even before the rent increase goes into effect because it's scary. They don't know what's going to happen. They're getting all of these notices about these huge rent increases. And it's just a really intimidating process for a lot of tenants. And so what you will see a lot of times is even before the rent increase goes into effect, a lot of these buildings will start emptying out, which is really unfortunate, particularly when, there are often good, there's usually never a great way to argue that the rent increase should actually be 0 because the current law is so broken. But there are often ways to argue that it should be lower than whatever the landlord is proposing it should be. But sometimes tenants don't even get that far because the whole process is just really intimidating and scary. And of the petitions that Beth has been reviewing since 2006, they covered nearly 1,000 units in the district. So that means 1,000 units in the district have been subject to these really big rent increases that have made units just unaffordable for low income and working class folks.
All right, so now we are going to transition to talking about what we would do under our platform. So first of all, how would we calculate the rent increase that landlords would get under a hardship petition? And I should say, we are not proposing eliminating hardship petitions. And one reason for that is that some kind of hardship mechanism for landlords is actually required by the Constitution. And so the idea is that if you have rent control and you're limiting what property owners can make, you have to have some kind of exception so that if landlords aren't making enough money, that they can get a rent increase that would be beyond what rent control would allow. So we need to have something in the law, but of course our goal is to keep it kind of as minimal as possible, and really focus on the landlords who can make a good argument that they're just not making enough money. And hopefully that's not very many in a place like DC. So we are proposing that the landlord would get a minimum amount of profit each year based on inflation, and it would be based on those income and expenses. And so you would still have the basic profit formula that we've already gone over, looking at income the same way we do under the law right now, looking at expenses the same way we do under the law right now. We are proposing a few little clarifications to the law on what counts as income and expenses, but basically not changing that calculation. But the difference is the profit rate they get. And so we would make it just a straight up profit rate, has nothing to do with equity. And then right now the percentage is 12%. We want it to be a really minimum rate that is tied to inflation. And so then you have to decide, well, what's inflation? What number are we going to pick? And so the number that we've picked is the 10-year, what the return is on a 10-year treasury bill. And that's a really low number. So right now it's about 1 or 2%. And so, there might be times where it would be a little bit higher than that. But it would not be that high and would never approach 12%, at least not any time in modern economic times. We also have provisions that the landlord would have to take any increase that gets approved in increments of 5% each year. So just to explain what that means, let's say a landlord was approved for a 20% rent increase. They would have to take that over 4 years. 5%, 5%, 5%, 5%. And actually, if it's that high, they would not be able to keep going after 3 years and would have to show again that they have a hardship, because we also have a provision that says it's not a permanent rent increase and it would go away after 3 years. So practically speaking, I think what that would mean is after 3 years, if a landlord still was not making a profit, the minimum profit without those rent increases, they could file another hardship petition and try to get the rent increase put back in place, or maybe a different rent increase level. But they would have to keep showing that they are experiencing that hardship, meaning not making the minimum profit at least once every 3 years. And so just going back to our example from before, if you had that landlord who's getting $150,000 a year in income, he's making that $50,000 profit, and he has $500,000 in equity. As Amanda was saying, under the current law, he's entitled to get $120,000 in profit. That's another $70,000 a year. And that just means the tenants have to pay $70,000 more in rent spread across their units. And so based on what we had in the example is the rent amount, that would be a 58% rent increase. And that's pretty common in terms of what we see. Just going back to the slides, actually they're a little bit higher on average. And so the formula working out that way is often what we see, that they actually are making a profit, but it's not considered high enough under the current formula, and so they get a really big rent increase. Under our proposal, the Reclaim Rent Control Coalition, you would just look at his profit and you'd say he's making $50,000, that's above the minimum, and so and you would figure that out, 50,000 divided by the 150,000 in income, so it's a 33% profit rate, and so that's well above whatever any minimum would be, and that means that that landlord would not get any increase. And so just in general, which landlords would benefit under our proposal? It would be landlords who have buildings who have lower rents maybe right now, but also have higher expenses. And then just in general, landlords who are not making a profit right now. And so as we mentioned, right now, if you looked at who is filing, half of those landlords wouldn't qualify. They're making a profit and they wouldn't be able to file. I do think we have to recognize there are probably some landlords who don't file right now because the way the formula works right now doesn't work for them, but it might actually work for them under the new law. And so, I think it's hard to guess overall, would the number of petitions go up or down or stay the same? I want to think it would go down, but we won't know for sure until the laws change. But I think we would hope that even if the number, let's say, stayed the same in terms of the number of petitions filed, that what they would be entitled to under this formula would be a much smaller rent increase. And then the other thing is that because it would be capped at 5% a year, no matter what, even if a landlord got approved to take a 20 or 30% rent increase, they would only be able to take it in those small little increments. And so tenants would not face a really large rent increase all at once. And overall, we would certainly hope that the end rent increase would be lower as well, at least for most buildings. And so I'm going to look in the chat box and people should put in, I'm going to stop the sharing, I think. Although maybe we can go back to that slide just to put our emails back up, but I'm going to look at the chat box and see what what questions. So Adam Marshall has just added that the 10-year yield right now is down below 1%. And I think it's going to stay pretty low because it tends to track with other measures. And right now, banks want those kinds of rates to be really low. So during a recession, that does tend to happen. So if folks have questions, you can raise your hand, as Farah was saying at the beginning, but you can also just write a question in the chat box, or if there's anything that you want to add from your own experience dealing with one of these, if you're an attorney or an organizer or a tenant who's seen one of these cases, please let us know by one of those ways and we will try to answer your questions. And yes, we can go back to the last slide. Let me do that because that has our email addresses. So the best way to reach me or Amanda, sorry, just give me a second here, is by email. We have both worked on, oh, why is it not pulling up? There we go. We have both worked on these types of cases and we both work at Legal Aid, and Legal Aid has taken on a number of these cases over the years. So those are our email addresses at Legal Aid, which is the best way to reach us.
Beth, I think they're also asking to see the slide before that one.
Oh, got it.
Yeah. And Beth, I don't need to put you on the spot, but do you want to talk a little bit about how the proposed legislation kind of deals with enforcement of the housing code as it relates to petitions?
Sure, and this is going to be for all petitions, and I can mention, actually I'll mention a couple other things that are a little more detailed since we definitely have time. So in terms of housing code violations for all petitions, there's a provision in our bill that says that a landlord will have to show that within 30 days before filing, either they had an inspection and no violations were found, or they had a prior inspection, violations were found, but they had fixed all of them and there had been a re-inspection. And that will be a basis to dismiss a case at the beginning if tenants can show that the landlord didn't meet that requirement. And so, as Amanda was saying earlier, a lot of that language is kind of in the law right now, but it's not as clear. And so we wanted to make it really clear. And then what is important, I think, is the idea that the landlord has the burden of showing that, and that you could dismiss the case right away at the beginning. And the landlord wouldn't be able to go forward if they cannot show that. We also put some language in the bill. So part of what happens in the process right now is that a government audit is done once the hardship petition is filed with the government. So they pay a private auditor to look at the numbers. And our experience is that audit is not very good. It doesn't find things that it really should. And you know, if that audit actually did a good job, then a lot of tenants probably wouldn't have to go find lawyers to help them fight these, because the auditor could catch things. And it might be then, if you came to me or Amanda, we would look at everything and we'd say, actually, like, they probably did this increase correctly. There may not be a lot we can do, or we can only fight it based on housing code violations, you know, and that's just not what happens right now. So we just put in some language to make sure that the auditor checks all the things they should be checking when they do the audit, and also that the auditors they use are individuals who are well qualified, who know about rental housing, have some experience with rental housing, so that hopefully they would do a better job than they do right now.
Yeah, somebody, the audits are terrible. Somebody's comments, the audits are terrible. And they're really important, right, for folks who don't end up finding a lawyer, though I hope that a lot of people who get these hardship petitions filed against them do come find lawyers, at least now, when the audits often miss so many things. But that roof example that I was talking about is an audit that I was looking at, and it was just completely missed. That this one-time expense that is clearly actually a capital expense should not have been allowed in its entirety. And the impact of that is huge. If the auditor had caught that, it would have meant, you know, a 20% increase versus a 42% increase. That would have been approved by the rent administrator. And so it's really important that those audits get fixed. And yeah, that's an interesting point about people who inherit buildings can benefit a lot from hardship petition law, because if they inherit a building without a mortgage, it means that they're entitled to 12% of whatever the assessed value on that property is. So if it's a $1 million property and they have absolutely no sort of mortgages or liens on it, that means they're entitled to $120,000 return, and that's it. There's no way to argue that they're entitled to less.
One thing I will mention, and I'm going to stop sharing again, but if anybody wants the slides back up, let us know, because it's easier for me anyway to see the chat box if I take it down, is that under something we're not changing is that when landlords file this, if they're not making a profit, they can take an immediate 5% rent increase, more or less immediate, after 90 days. It used to be much higher, and the council fixed it, so it's only a 5% rent increase, and that only applies if the landlord is not making a profit at all. And so just based on what we've seen since 2006 anyway, that's only about half of the petitions that are filed, the landlord qualifies even to get that initial 5% increase. The idea of that is just, if you have to wait more than 90 days to get an answer on whether it's going to be approved, that the landlord, because they're facing a hardship, should be able to take an immediate rent increase. And then if it turns out it's too high, they're supposed to give the money back to the tenants. If it's too low, eventually, you know, they get approved for a higher number. Does anyone else have any questions? All right. Well, I think if folks have feedback to provide, it would be really helpful, because I think as this, all of our kind of stay at home, work at home, et cetera, situations continue, we certainly could do this for some of the other parts of the platform and try to break them down a little bit more, and including if you think we should provide even a little more detail on the slides next time, or, we were trying to kind of balance things. So feel free to let me or Amanda or Farah know if you have any thoughts about how we could improve it even more next time, because I think we can do some more of these.
Well, thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Of course.
I was thinking it might be, we can talk about this after, but it would be neat to make it into like a fact sheet or something like that we could share too. Maybe like a 1 or 2 pager. Because I think the example was really illustrative too. And with some of the facts, right, about how it's played out with your audit of the last almost 20 years.
Yeah, I wonder if, and I'll run that by Amanda, but you know what I'd like to do, Farah, is actually add some of the things we talked about to the slides, and then we could circulate the slides to the entire coalition. But let me work with Amanda on adding some of the things that we kind of orally said to make it a little bit more complete.
Great.
And I like the fact sheet idea too.